Hello and welcome, Sheriff here. Today, like promised, we take a look at another bird of the Il2 series, and this time it is the MiG-3. To be fair, I already knew what plane I wanted to show next, but I was glad that my choices bodes very well with your demand. Like in the last video, we will take a look at the basics, like the cockpit, the taxiing and the takeoff, but most important, how to fight in the MiG-3. The MiG-3 is really a plane which can be damn deadly in the right hands, but can be even more deadly to its own pilot, which was one of the main reasons why the MiG was phased out of service relatively early on in the war. However, an experienced pilot or a pilot who is eager to learn will enjoy the advantages of the MiG-3. We explore the reasons for this in the upcoming minutes, and I hope you enjoy. If you sit for the first time in the cockpit of a MiG-3, you see some nice features which you don't see on other Russian fighter designs. First off, compared to the LAG, the LF5 and the Yak-1, you will see that you have a very nice all-around visibility. There are some cockpit bars, but you can see very well to the rear, and the bars to the left and right are at a height where they are not blocking the view to important angles. The view to the front is very clear and not blocked by anything on the cowling or by armored glass or something like this. If you are used to the Yak, you will be pleased to see that the fuel gauge is easy to see in the top right corner. From right to left we have then the manifold pressure, the artificial horizon, which is another great feature in comparison to other Russian fighter designs, but then we have the compass, and then to the left we have the altitude indicator. In the middle row we have from left to right the speed, the turn and bank, the climb rate and the RPM indicator. To the very right we have the engine temperature. For normal operation you should try to keep the temperature around 100 degrees Celsius. In combat you have to keep the temperatures below 120 degrees Celsius to avoid engine damage. In the lower row of the instrument panel you see the water and the oil temperatures, and again keep them around 100 degrees and you are fine. In combat you have to keep the temperatures below 120, the oil is generally a little bit cooler than that and it is easier to maintain, but the most important gauge here is certainly the water. Unlike German aircraft and like all Russian aircrafts, the MiG has no engine automation. So for the MiG you have to set up keys for the water, the oil radiators, the mixture and the RPM. But that's basically it, and the usage of those is maybe easier than you think. After the engine is started, I raise the RPM to the maximum. I raise the mixture to 60% and I open my radiators around 35%, both oil and water radiators. This is basically my personal standard setup for the MiG-3. For relatively low temperatures, that's basically it for the MiG-3. You only have to raise the mixture after takeoff, but that's it. But later more about the engine stuff. The wide landing gear makes taxiing relatively easy as soon as you get the hang out of the tail wheel. Sounds familiar, right? The tail wheel is key to good taxiing. Again, however, the tail wheel system of the MiG is strange, to say at least. First off, you can steer the direction where the tail wheel is pointing. This sounds awesome, right? Yeah, it is, but the problem is that you can steer it with the rudder by pushing it over a certain threshold of deflection. I think it is 40% of deflection. So let's say you don't push the rudder at all and you throttle up and you start rolling. At that moment your tail wheel acts pretty much like every other fighter where you have a fixed tail wheel. Nothing special here. The MiG taxis forward and gets pushed to the right by the prop wash and torque. But as soon as you push then the left rudder over a certain deflection to counter the torque, the tail wheel starts to move and then lets the MiG taxi to the left instead of just countering out the torque. The pilot has to anticipate the effect of the rudder and the tail wheel. That becomes very important at the takeoff later on. If you are used to German fighters, you will notice that the MiG has no toe brakes, so you can't just brake the two main wheels independently. You have to use the brake button and the rudder simultaneously to use the left and right wheel brake. The brake button basically triggers the brake system and the usage of the rudder controls which side of the brakes you want to use. So to summarize, throttle up a little to get the MiG going, maybe 50% throttle. As soon as you start rolling, throttle down to 35% again to keep rolling without getting too fast. Use a little bit rudder for taxiing straight without using your tail wheel. Use the rudder even more to move your tail wheel and therefore turn even sharper. Use the brakes and rudder in concert to turn even sharper or on the spot. As soon as you approach the runway, check both directions of the runway to be sure that nobody is coming in, and check the far end of the runway as well for surprises. Maybe somebody does an emergency landing or lands the wrong way. Roll to the middle of the runway and align yourself with the runway properly. Trust me, this step is important. Line up properly. Not a little bit left or right, properly straight. Important in the MiG. Some people say there are two moments where a MiG really wants to kill you. That is at takeoff and at landing. So hopefully you still remember that your tail wheel is moving when you move your rudder above a certain extent. You still do, right? Good. While practicing the takeoff, just move your rudder left and right again while standing still to memorize at which threshold the tail wheel starts to move. Okay. I personally take off in this way. I keep my RPM at 100% and again I set my mixture to 60%. I trim my nose a little up. Some pilots like to trim the rudder to the left as well, but I personally keep my rudder where it is and I use no flaps at all. I gradually throttle up to 50% and the MiG starts to roll very slowly, but that's okay. I often don't look at that phase on the runway, I just look at my turn and bank indicator. I try to keep that thing in the middle. If I see that my indicator is going to the left, I release the left rudder only a tiny bit and I wait if the MiG is going straight again by herself. In any case, it's super important that you don't do any sudden rudder compensations here. After the first meters of rolling, I throttle gradually up to 80% and I keep it there. I just focus on my turn and bank indicator and I wait that I get more speed. Sometimes it's necessary to use a little bit of right rudder, but again make sure that you don't hammer down on the rudder. Very little input is advised. The super sensitive rudder makes MiG takeoffs often funny to look at, as the nose is going left to right even with experienced pilots. With many hours of flight time you can get rid of it. However, so far I know no pilot who can reliably bring the MiG into the air without at least a little bit swaying of the nose left and right. As soon as you hit roughly 160 kph, the tail wheel starts to lift from the runway. Apply a little pressure on the stick to avoid that the nose slams on the runway. At this point I throttle slowly up to 100% throttle. I'm sorry to inform you at that moment here that you still need to be careful with the rudder. It is super sensitive even in flight, so keep handling that rudder very carefully. Start to pull up carefully at around 200 kph. As soon as you are in the air, retract your landing gear and get some airspeed before you do some more fancy maneuvers. At the end of this chapter, some general tips if you have trouble taking off. First off, check your mixture. That mixture should be very low. Most of the problems of the MiG are because you are either throttling up too fast, you have a too high throttle at the beginning of your takeoff, or you have a too high mixture. A low mixture and low throttle reduces a lot of the torque and you have much less to do with the rudder. The second thing which happens to beginners of the MiG-3 at takeoff is often that they overcompensate with the rudder and they accidentally trigger the tail wheel. As soon as you trigger the tail wheel over a certain speed in the MiG, there is no hope for you. You will sway your nose left and right. Your aircraft will be just uncontrollable. So practice your rudder movements, check your throttle settings, throttle up very slowly. That are basically the things you need to know for good takeoff. And of course, practice. The reason why the MiG was well liked by good pilots in reality becomes a little bit more apparent as soon as you are with your crate in the air and you have some speed. All of a sudden the MiG becomes stable and nice to fly. The biggest selling points of the MiG-3 is the speed. The speed in unboosted mode is somewhat comparable to a BF-109 F2 on combat power. However, with radiators open up to only 30% and on boosted power, you can catch them quite easily on all altitudes if the F2 is not on emergency power. However, a BF-109 F4 on emergency power will outpace the MiG on all altitudes. The MiG is often available in Moscow theaters where it played a vital role historically, and in this time frame the MiG is quite competitive as there are no F4s and G2s. The management of the engine is not very complicated. In climbing and in combat I use 100% throttle, 100% RPM and 80% mixture. The radiators are opened or closed in dependence of the air temperature. Generally speaking, you have to open the water radiators a little bit more than the oil radiator. For super cold temperatures, you can open the water radiators around 25% and the oil a little bit more closed maybe. For super hot temperatures, you can keep the oil around 35% and you have to open the water radiators to 45%. In the case you overheat your engine, you have enough time to correct your radiator settings. But don't focus too hard on those percentage numbers, just look at your temperatures of your oil, of your engine and of your water and correct the radiator settings in dependence. Of course, to reach the absolute top speed of the MiG, you have to close the radiators completely, which overheats the engine quite quickly. As soon as your water temperature reaches 120 degrees Celsius, you have roughly 5 minutes to bring them down again, or your engine will cease. To save fuel and to keep the engine cool, I reduce throttle and the mixture in level flight. The RPM, however, has less impact on temperatures and on fuel consumption. The MiG-3 has a boost mode, which gets enabled as soon as you enrich the mixture over 84%. This gives you quite a speed boost. It took me 15 minutes to damage the engine with the boost, so you have plenty of time with the boost. However, the fuel consumption is very high on 100% mixture. According to the in-game description, the MiG manages the mixture all by herself when it's at 50%. However, I noticed there is quite some power missing in that case, even on full throttle, so I personally control the mixture by myself. Around 80% for cruise and climbing and more for combat. To catch enemies or to run away, I use the boost. However, you have to be careful with very high boost values. Let's say you enrich your mixture to 100%, so full boosted mode, and you have to throttle down in a dogfight. If you then dive down and open up your throttle very suddenly, it can happen that you over-rev your engine. So if you are in full boosted mode, gradually increase throttle after dives, especially when you are in full boosted mode. What is interesting is that the MiG-3 has no second supercharger stage. The MiG-3 is optimized on very high altitudes above 7,000 meters, which is another reason why it was phased out in reality, as most fights took place on relatively low altitudes in the east. Good thing is, you don't have to think about switching your gear. Bad thing is, the performance on low altitude isn't as good as it could be. Okay, we spoke now a lot about the engine, but this is of course only half the story. First off, the MiG-3 has an interesting flap system. With one press on your flap button, the flaps are extending fully, like you are maybe used of the Yak or other Russian fighters. However, the MiG has a flap limiter, where you can decide to which extent the flaps are extending in the case you press the button. That gives you some nice options in combat. However, even if you have no limiter active, the deflection of the flaps is dependent on the current speed, as the incoming airflow is at high speeds so strong that the flaps are getting pushed down. So you have to wait until your MiG is low enough that your flaps are able to extend fully. To remove the limiter, just keep the Extend Flaps button pressed until the limiter reaches 100% again. Like I hinted before, the MiG becomes nice and stable on normal speeds, but is very unstable on low speeds, especially around the rudder axis. That makes slow turning fights borderline insanity and aiming at slow speeds at least difficult. So the MiG is far, far, far away from the fighting style of a Yak. The MiG is heavier than a Bf-19 and has a lower thrust-to-weight ratio and a higher wing loading, and therefore climbs worse, turns worse and accelerates worse. But what impacts the fighting style the most is that the MiG control surfaces are locking up at higher speeds. It turns better than a Focke-Wulf in low and average speeds, but I personally would not try to outturn one in a high-speed chase. Rolling is fine for low and average speeds, but gets increasingly difficult with higher speeds. What is great is that the MiG pilot is able to trim the rudder additionally to the elevator. That is really great for a relaxed climb or to have it a little bit easier at takeoff to cancel out that torque. I use the elevator trim constantly to keep my aim steady and to make it possible that I don't have to use my stick to keep my nose steady. That makes dive attacks way easier, for example. Another thing is that the MiG is relatively sturdy in a dive at a speed where the Yak is already losing some ailerons and stuff. The MiG can still keep diving, and if close to structural damage, the aircraft starts to shake before it gets too fast. So basically you get a warning beforehand. Though the MiG-3 is optimized for high altitudes, it has some loadout capabilities for ground attacking. It can carry rockets and 50 kg or 100 kg bombs. I cannot imagine, with all the Russian ground attacker capabilities, the Il2 and the PE2, that the Red Air Force really needs a MiG as a ground attacker. So I personally never even considered putting those disgusting things on my wings. But I wanted to mention that these things exist. But if we take a look at the standard armament, it features one 7.62mm machine gun and a 12.7mm UBS machine gun, the Russian 50 cal. Both guns are installed in the nose of the MiG-3, which makes the gun easy to aim. However, those two guns can be swapped for either two 50 cal machine guns with 350 rounds per gun, or even two 20mm Shavak cannons with 150 rounds per gun. Additionally, you can install gun pods on the wings with two 50 cal machine guns. In reality, the gun pods were, at least by some aces, disliked as they increased drag and hampered the MiG's maybe only strength, speed. And the gun pods only feature 145 rounds per gun, which is not a lot considering you have already 700 on board. I don't like the gun pods as well. I personally prefer the two 50 cal machine guns on my MiG-3. They pack a good punch and they are very capable in killing the very fragile German fighters in Battle of Stalingrad. The high muzzle velocity comes in handy in deflection shooting and kills enemy pilots very often, causes engine and fuel fires, so they are very powerful. I only equip the 250 cals and I don't even consider the gun pods. Forget about the gun pods and the 20mm. The 20mm are slow firing, they have a slow muzzle velocity, so hard to hit enemy fighters. The 50 cals are really fine. The MiG can carry 480 liters of fuel, which gives you at normal cruise almost 1.5 hours flight time. And with a little tweaking of the mixture and throttle, it gives you much more time in the air. I personally use around 350 liters per sortie, which gives you around 1 hour flight time. It makes you a lot lighter from the start, but that's of course personal taste, I would say. Okay, so now after discussing the characteristics of the MiG-3, it's maybe already clear how to deploy the MiG in an actual fight. There are some distinct similarities between the fighting style of the MiG and the Focke-Wulf. Of course, it's not the same, but yeah, there are certainly similarities. If you search for an aircraft which has at least kinda some of the strength of the German aircraft, you will then end up with a MiG. And one of the biggest reasons why good real-life pilots liked the MiG was the speed. They like to be on par with the German aircraft, at least in one regard. So basically key to a good MiG sortie is to keep up your speed, to have good situational awareness and using first and foremost surprise attacks as a key element. To achieve that, I like to climb with my MiG to a decent altitude, and I like to keep myself on the move between objectives or between the enemy airfield and the objective. Goal is to jump planes which are busy with navigating and are still on the way to the objectives. Those aircrafts can be of course bombers, but for the most part you will find 109s. And you will be surprised how many brain AFK 109s are flying around when there is no objective in the direct vicinity. For some reason a lot of pilots just expecting enemy planes around objectives, which is kinda right, but at the same time very dangerous. And those kills sound easy and stuff, but everybody who flew already a Yak, a Luck or an LA5 on altitude know that nothing is more frustrating than to be on a 109's low 6 and he's just idling away from you because he's just faster. The MiG-3 can catch exactly those. However, there are a few challenges in those situations. One of the most glaring one is often that if you want to get guns on your enemy, you either have the problem that the damn elevator doesn't move anymore and you can't aim because you are so fast, or you are so slow that your nose is twitching around, which you certainly saw a few times in the footage I showed you already here. That is caused because the rudder is so sensitive and it's really hard sometimes to get guns on the enemy when you are kinda slow. So you really have to make yourself clear before you go in a dive where your nose has to be when you are at the enemy. Later on, when you already have picked up some speed, it's maybe not anymore possible to change course. And on the other hand, if you are already relatively slow and behind your enemy, you have to focus on aiming a lot so you don't spray your bullets across the sky. To solve this with a MiG, I really like to get in very close, ideally on the low 6, and to give a burst into the center of the enemy aircraft. In most cases that seals the deal. If the enemy sees you in your approach, the tactics are quite similar to a Focke-Wulf. Either you have hopefully some energy and you can zoom back up, or you use your excessive speed to just push through, which is maybe often the better course of action, especially if you have mates in the area. They can then slot in and exploit that the guy has to focus on you. If you have to turn, then do that in a wide manner to keep your speed up. Don't use any sudden turns or something like this. Use that turn to observe your opponent and to scan your surroundings for other threats, for example. If you are in your attack on the same or in the lower energy state and behind the enemy, you better hit him quickly, as the 109 can and will outturn you. If you stick too long on the tail of a 109, you lose the speed you need to get away, and then the 109 just outturns you. You won't be able to turn with the 109 anyway for a prolonged time, as with the lower speed the MiG gets more and more unstable and clear-cut maneuvers get more and more difficult. Sometimes in turns, if you have to turn, it's often beneficial to drop some flaps. I personally keep my flap limiter for that reason around 50%. I mean, the flaps won't extend fully anyway in most situations, as your MiG is too fast in a natural combat environment. But to drop flaps really enhances the turning capabilities of the MiG and makes turns a little bit more easy. Be careful with flaps, it slows you really down, but sometimes it's really necessary to get at least some maneuverability in slow speeds. But keep in mind, the ultimate goal in your MiG is to keep distance from your enemies, to have room for maneuvering and to strike on unsuspecting enemies. Really, those knife fights with turning is not really the MiG's business. If you have to run from your enemy, I recommend to run in a straight line, if you are hopefully still out of gun range. With normal radiator settings and 100% throttle and on boosted mode, you will outrun BF-109 F2s with ease. Never try to outclimb a 109. That's a bad idea. The much higher power to weight ratio and the lower wing loading of the 109 grills the MiG in a sustained climb. Never outclimb a BF-109F. Dives are okay, but keep in mind that the 109 has a higher structural strength and can keep diving even when the MiG is at the edge of structural damage. At that point you have to get slower to avoid damage. The real problem is that at that moment the control surfaces are so locked up that you can't evade anymore, and then you have a faster diving 109 on your tail with a beautiful shot on a MiG which has a turn circle of a B-17. That's really problematic sometimes. What works good, however, against attacking 109s are split S, especially a series of those. The 109s lock up as well and can't roll so easily. And if you aren't that fast, the roll rate of the MiG is fine. It's easy to do accidental snap rolls in that moment, but that's better than to be grilled. But don't get me wrong, if the 109 does everything right, your options are limited. However, if you maneuver against the 109, the goal has to be to get, with some clever split S and some rolls, enough separation to get out of gun range and then to be able to run in a straight line again. To run in a straight line is the best defensive maneuver in a MiG. To get separation or sometimes in an attack, it's really crucial to slow down as fast as you can to get some maneuverability back. If you are ever in a situation where your dive is so fast that everything is locking up, I can recommend you to deploy your flaps a little. They won't extend fully, but it helps to get some drag. A second option is to open your radiators a bit more. Yes, your radiators. They cause drag as well, and sometimes that helps to get a little bit faster your maneuverability back. As soon as you are slow enough, you can then aim, or you can do your evasive maneuvers you were planning to do. And again, the end of this chapter, the best thing you can do is to fly the MiG with a mate. A wingman really helps, and the MiG is really fast and is therefore a really good drag and back tactician. I surely make at some point a video about drag and back, but the MiG is fast and can run away from enemies, and it's only logical that then a second MiG can catch up to that enemy, so you can exploit that. So last chapter for this tutorial is of course the landing, and landing the MiG isn't that difficult if you don't forget about the tail wheel. Approach the runway, take a look if it's clear, and land in that direction where planes are taking off as well. That avoids collisions and makes takeoffs and landings faster overall. Lose speed and altitude until you have around 300 kph and line up with the runway. Drop your landing gear and extend full flaps. Don't forget to reset your flap limiter if you have set one. Aim with your reticle at the beginning of the runway and let your speed drop until you are around 200 kph. And keep that speed. As soon as you approach the runway, pull up and keep yourself a few meters above the runway. Don't pull up too hard, just hold the reticle on the horizon. The stall speed of the MiG with flaps is roughly 140 kph, so you really don't want to drop below that. Position yourself in a 3-point attitude as soon as you reach roughly 150 kph and let the airspeed drop further. After touchdown, control your path with a little rudder and don't forget the mechanics of the tail wheel. Use very small amounts of rudder. As soon as you are slow enough, use your brakes and your rudder to use your left and right wheel brake and bring your plane to the stop. The landings, very similar to the takeoff, needs a bit of practice. The most common mistakes are drop a wing at the landing, that you stall a wing, that you bounce around on the runway as soon as you have touched down, then you are too fast, or that you just do a spin as soon as you're on the ground, then you use your tail accidentally by pushing the rudder too hard. But other than that, I really recommend to practice a lot in the combat missions and the test flight, call it like you want. But that's basically it, what I have to say about the MiG-3 for the moment. I really hope you liked it, and if you did, think about to like and to share the video, and if you are really awesome, you consider to buy me a cup of coffee if you want on Patreon. Plenty of cups were used to create this video, this is for sure. Thank you very much for watching, see you in the next one.